I'd now like to call on Mr. Quintin Walcott, Co-Executive Director at Connect. We always have the question, well, what are men doing? And I'm sure that Quintin is always called on to speak to tell us what men are doing. He has extensive experience working with groups for young and adult males on masculinity, manhood development, fathering, batters intervention, and accountability. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I need to apologize. My energy is kind of low. I've been sick the last couple of days, but I'm going to try to get through this. I would actually have you jumping around and doing push-ups and things like that to bring up the energy, but that's just a joke. I wouldn't even do it. So yes, my name is Quintin Walcott. Everyone who knows me, family, people in the field call me Q, so feel free to do the same. And I've been doing this work for about 18 years now. I started when I was about 7 years old. Nah, seriously, but 18 years. And in that work, I've been working with families and communities, survivors, children of witness, but my specialty in the field, and I think it's very important to have a specialty, this particular specialty, is working with men and boys. Because you know, Val passed today, and a round of applause for all the effort that took for since 1995 and till today. The fact that we have to spend a lot of energy on something like that, I think is sad, but it's important to have because of the resources that it brings to communities that are doing very important work. And like it was mentioned, Val was far from perfect. There's communities and families that we work with at Connect, and we do domestic violence and gender violence prevention work throughout New York City that don't see Val as a viable option for their situation in terms of being safe in New York City and not having to give information about someone that they're relying upon for their status here in the United States. So there's a lot of trickiness that comes with VAWA and a lot of legislation around this. So it's really important to recognize that, but also important the hard work and the need for it, right? Because we do a lot of work in communities where first we start off doing work with systems, child welfare system, and looking at how wherever there was child abuse or neglect, that there was most likely going to be domestic violence. In almost 80% or up to 90% of the cases that we were working with, there was some DV involved. And in particular, before I became part of Connect, I did work with a preventive agency. And I think 97% of the cases that worked with at our agency, there was some form of domestic violence, right? So it's important to kind of really look at the systems that are available and do an analysis of that, how effective they are or not. And when we started Connect, we said that I think it was mentioned at the time it was 20% of domestic violence was reported, and now it's about 27%. I heard today, and of that 27% that was reported, that meant that there was 80% of the people out there in the world, in the communities, that weren't reporting DV. And of that 27%, 20% of that ended up in some form of services. So that said a lot about what's really happening, what services are available, are they effective, or do they meet the needs of the people in our communities. So I think just a little backdrop around Connect. And in that work, a lot of it was really, 18 years ago we're talking about now, I was really I came to Connect. We were under a different name, part of Urban Justice Center at the time, but I came to really learn around how to do work with batterers, abusive men. And I was sent there by accident, thinking that it was around working with youth who were impacted by violence or what have you, but it turned out to be really working with abusive men or abusive partners. And from that point forward, I remember I used to sit in this room with Sally McNichol, who is my co-executive director at Connect, and we were just colleagues at the time, and I would kind of like sit in this room like, wow, what's happening in this room? There's all these acronyms, first of all, ACS, BCW, everybody's CSW, LCSW, all of this stuff happening. So I'm trying to figure out, navigate the acronyms, but one thing that stood out for me was that, we're doing a lot of talking about victims and survivors, rightfully so, but there wasn't really, even though we're talking about batterers intervention, there wasn't really a conversation about men, other than this this idea that, yeah, we need to set up to a group as this form of punishment, but it really was, we really kind of looking at Band-Aid approaches to dealing with domestic violence. Like what services can we put her in? How can we keep her safe? But for me, it was like, wow, I'm sitting, listening to this. It's like domestic violence doesn't start with the victim survivor. It starts with some type of, ultimately an attitude or belief system that we're really trying to work with. But it starts with somebody that's doing abuse. So let's kind of focus our attention on really, one, preventing it from happening. And if it does happen, how can we intervene early on in the process? And that is a form of prevention in itself. So for me, it was like, wow, there wasn't really a lot of work around batteries or how do we work with men who are abusive or youth that were abusive at that time. So, my thing was, well, let's kind of really push this a little bit further. Let's shift some of the focus on who's doing the abuse, taking the onus and responsibility and the blame from the victim survivor onto the person who's typically doing it. And that was, 85 to 90% of the cases that were reported, of those 27% were men that were committing this abuse towards women and girls. So for me, it was like, wow, I need to maybe, if I stick around in this work, as I plan on doing it for 2 months, right? 2 months, pay for my tuition at school, pay for some applications, and I would kind of move on. And then 18 years later. But it was really significant that, one, that Connect at the time, wanted to focus on this. And I was like the first male that they hired, and still only 2 of us, but in the process, there's been, part of my work is really to broaden this network of men who kind of see this as an important issue. And when Setu asked that question early on, who here has seen some form of violence or been, experienced some form of violence? And that's a really critical question, because that's something that we say in a different form every time when we work with a full group like this. Who here has witnessed violence, who's been a victim of violence, and who has committed violence, all right? That's the part that we sometimes we miss out. And, we've all committed some form of violence, but in particular in terms of violence against women and girls or intimate partner violence, that's the critical piece. So with that, Connect does many different things, and I could take hours to kind of really explain all our different programs, but for tonight's purposes, I will focus on our men's work. We work with families. We have a training institute where we train up to 300 people a year to either work with perpetrators of violence, empowerment groups for victims, survivors of domestic violence, and children who witness violence, and then also parenting in all different capacities. And we have a legal helpline that helps survivors and bystanders kind of navigate the legal systems if that's the route you want to go, and also, if you don't want to deal with legal systems, help you develop strategies around being safe without the legal system. But we took this mission on of really working with men and boys because, one, some survivors, it was talked today, some survivors leave after the first form of abuse. They're gone. Support systems are in place. They have the finances to be safe. They have a friend that they can go to, a family member, what have you, but they're in a position to be safe in that way. Some women leave and come back up to 8 to 9 times before they fully are in a position to leave. And then some don't leave, right? But that doesn't mean they want to be abused. So with that thinking, when I came on to Connect, it was really to kind of really look at why should we engage men? Why is that important? Not just batteries, right? Because many studies say that batteries programs do not work. And they cannot work by themselves, right? There needs to be a community that's connected to it to keep them accountable, the batteries program, and then the individuals who are abusive. So that's important. So with that, we said, why should we work with men? And first of all, it was for those women who don't leave in those situations. And when you do leave, that's when danger escalates to a higher level when someone leaves a situation. So it was really to kind of look at how can we keep women and children safe. That was our primary strategy around working with men. And also, how can we engage men to give them the help that they need to transform those attitudes and belief systems that perpetuate this behavior and this violence. So that's why we took on this initiative of saying, why do we incorporate men in our work? And with that, we're looking at, of course, we look at perpetrators. You know, perpetrators are, wow, okay, looks like a Q minutes, all right. But really quickly, to really kind of look at how can we move perpetrators and also bystanders, right? Because I think bystanders are really crucial to, you know, ending and interrupting cycles of violence. How can we move perpetrators, you know, because most don't go to jail. They live, still live in these abusive situations, but they're not just batterers, they may be fathers, or they may be pastors in our communities. They're upstanding in different parts of their lives. How can we move them from being perpetrators and bystanders and becoming an active bystander to allies with women and girls, and also activists on our own efforts? That's our goal with working with men. And we do that in many different ways by working in communities. We work in schools, work in college campuses. We have these groups where we workshops that we look at not just domestic violence and how it impacts women and girls and other men, but really how does it impact the person who's doing the abuse and how does that show up? And that's important because one part of it is, yes, the self-interest piece. I go to jail, you're impacted in this way, but what are the benefits to stopping these forms of violence? How does it benefit you as an individual? And that's very important. And that's really meeting people where they are in a sense where it's like, all right, so I've socialized, a lot of it is about socialization in different forms of masculinities that contribute to this notion that it's okay for me to treat women this way, for me to see them as objects and property and what have you. But it's really how can we move it beyond that, right? And a lot of it is really being creative in terms of having the courage, right? Because all of you raised your hand earlier, I say to ask that question, is it's really brave and courageous to even admit that you've been part of that experience. So it takes that same courage to even engage people who you may be scared of, who may be your father, who may be your mother in those situations. So really having the courage to do that. And then secondly, being creative, right? We got to really be creative, think really outside. I know it's a jargony term, it's used all the time, but thinking outside the box in terms of how do we engage people who have been abusive or victims and survivors of not just intimate partner violence, but institutional violence that contributes as well to our decisions around being abusive in our relationships. And then the other piece, so that creativity piece is where the creative exercises that you do when you're out in the community to get people to really think about power and control and the impact of that and how people show up, right? I'm one of very few men that work in my organization, and I work in a field that's quote unquote predominantly a women's movement or issue, quote unquote. But if men are committing most of the violence, it's something about how we're raised and socialized that is really about male violence, and it's really an issue that we have to kind of take on and be honest about. It's really a community issue, it's a human rights issue, it's a global issue, but it's really something that's important for us to really kind of look at, opposition and sexism and also racism, right? We kind of always lose the fact that, women are victims of racism as well. So if you layer sexism and racism and classism and xenophobia, all these different things on top of that, that's the experiences that we go through. And that's my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh, for that very holistic definition and description of the activities of your organization. Our last speaker is Corianne Calabresi. She's Program Officer for Sexual Violence Trafficking and FGM at Equality Now.
Good evening, everyone. We've been throwing a lot of statistics out there tonight, so I thought I'd throw one more on top. I have lots more. Maybe we'll get to them. But okay, we're talking about violence against women tonight, and I think the most common statistic out there is that 1/3 of women worldwide will experience sexual violence at some point in their life. 1 in 3. It's really high. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you tonight about the work of Equality Now. Equality Now is an international women's rights organization that's dedicated to eradicating violence and discrimination against women and girls. Equality Now has 4 areas that we work in. We work in sexual violence, trafficking, female genital mutilation, and then we work on the discriminatory laws that perpetuate these violations. So although Equality Now has a lot of advocacy tools that we use to eradicate violence, I'm going to talk to you tonight about our legal advocacy work, because I think that that's really important when we're discussing access to justice. Okay, so we kind of do our legal advocacy work on 2 levels. We work on the international level, and then we work in various countries on a more local level. So at the international level, we are writing reports to various UN bodies and committees. We're working on international coalitions, and we write reports that we can use as advocacy tools. And then on the national level is where I think we do some of our more interesting work, so I'm going to focus on that. Not that the international work isn't great, it's just our national work actually deals with working with victims of violence, and then working with the grassroots organizations in countries that are working with these women and girls every day. So on the national level, we work with various governments to lobby them to either change the laws that are discriminatory or to implement laws that are on the books and that are good, but that the government isn't doing anything about. Because I think we've come a really long way in terms of getting laws changed that were discriminatory towards women, or getting new laws adapted that, you know, identify rape as a crime and different types of sexual assault as a crime. But it's one thing to actually get the laws on the books, and I think it's the first step to get the laws on the books, but it's a whole other thing to actually have those laws implemented, because the laws are only as strong as the government that enforces them. So on our national work, we work through our Adolescent Girls Legal Defense Fund. And the Adolescent Girls Legal Defense Fund identifies cases in various countries around the world that we can support through a national litigation process. And we try and choose cases that will either set an important legal precedent or enforce a law that hasn't been enforced yet. And we've had 10 cases in 9 different countries around the world so far. And it's my job to find some more of them. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our case in Zambia, because I think it's a really good example of how one case can make a big difference in a community. So before working in Equality Now's office in New York, I was actually working in their Nairobi office and in their Lusaka, Zambia office. And in 2006, we worked with our partner Women in Law in Southern Africa on Mary's case. So Mary was a 14-year-old girl who was attending school in Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia. And Mary is a very sweet girl. Mary has a lot of dreams that I think she's to go to college, and she's actually going to college now. It's great. But Mary was a 14-year-old girl going to high school in Lusaka when her teacher started approaching her after class. He started talking to her, you know, offering to tutor her, and one day Mary had been asking him for a test that he kept forgetting, and he kept forgetting, and he kept forgetting. And one day he said, you know, the test is just back at my house. Why don't you come with me? We'll go back to my house. I'll give you the test. So they go back to his house, and he raped Mary. Teacher rape in Zambia, or in Lusaka, Zambia, is incredibly rampant. Population Council did a study where 62% of the respondents said that they've experienced sexual assault in exchange for better grades or passing grades. So Mary's case was not unusual, unfortunately, but what was unusual about Mary was that she spoke up about it, and that her aunt took her to Women in Law in Southern Africa to do something about it. So originally, Mary and her aunt went to the police, but the police and prosecutors did nothing. So what we did with Women in Law in Southern Africa was we found a pro bono attorney to take Mary's case, and they sued the Ministry of Education and the Attorney General's office. So we sued the Ministry of Education for allowing this teacher to teach, because this was not the first time that there had been a sexual assault claim against him, and they kept moving him from school to school to school. And then we sued the Attorney General's office for refusing to investigate and prosecute this crime. It's cool because in Zambia we can actually do that, where we wouldn't be able to do that in the United States. So Mary won her case. She was awarded a $30,000 judgment, which in Zambia is a really large sum of money, and she's using that money to go to college. And the judge also, in his judgment, directed the Ministry of Education to adopt better guidelines for dealing with sexual assault victims. And although we wish he had held the Attorney General's office more accountable, he did direct them to investigate and prosecute the crime. Unfortunately, Mary's perpetrator had long since left the country, so he was never caught. But using the momentum from Mary's case, we worked with 8 other organizations on the ground in Lusaka to form a coalition. And through that coalition, we have done lawyers trainings to get more lawyers involved in doing sexual violence work. We've done journalist training so that they report more cases of sexual violence and it gets more attention. We've done medical trainings so that medical workers can actually know how to work with victims of sexual violence, because a lot of people don't know what to do when a sexual violence victim comes into their office. And then we've also used the case to lobby Parliament to change a lot of Zambia's discriminatory laws that it still has on the books. And we also worked with the Ministry of Education to adopt the new sexual assault reporting forms and practices that they were directed to adopt by the court. So this is just a great example, I think, of how one case can really work to change an entire community. Obviously, there's still a ton of work to be done in Lusaka, Zambia, but it has reached a lot more people than just one victim. As it's been mentioned, it's the Commission on Status of Women this week, and so I've been going to a lot of meetings, and a lot of them, you hear the same thing, but every once in a while there's like a gem that you can take with you. And lately a lot of people have been talking about community programs and awareness raising programs, and these are all essential to preventing violence against women. But at Equality Now, we also think that all of these programs need a legal framework to support these community awareness programs. And there is one woman who stood up in a meeting that I was in, and she said that she had been mutilated when she was a child, and that she probably would have done the same thing to her daughter if not for the fact that a couple was arrested in her community for mutilating their daughter before she could get the chance to do that to her daughter. And so one arrest, we think that it might not go a long way, but one arrest prevented this woman from mutilating her daughter, and probably other women in the community thought the same thing. So legal advocacy really is an important tool, and we've gotten really far on the international stage in terms of getting countries to adopt new laws, and now it's time to take it one step further and get those countries to actually implement the laws that are on the books. So yeah, I think I actually stuck to under the 10 minutes. But I'm happy to continue talking about this work and answer any questions.
Thank you very much for supporting general deterrence at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and for telling us this very interesting case. We now have time for questions.
Based on your expertise in your different fields, I wanted to ask you, how would you go about convincing a woman to maybe seeking help, and why should she go seek help if she can just probably neglect it and move on with her life in another aspect? I think that would help a lot of us here if we're confronted by individuals in that kind of environment.
Any of you want to tackle that?
One thing is I would never convince a woman to
Move the
report.
microphone.
That would be just the opposite of what a victim of gender-based violence needs, is someone telling them what to do. They need to regain control, and so I would certainly make those options available to them, but I would never try to convince them to report, because one thing we know, it's actually not 20% it's about 1/3 that report, 2/3 that don't. And I think that especially when we get into marginalized communities, you know, we're very suspicious of law enforcement, and I don't think that law enforcement has necessarily, I mean, maybe here in New York it may be different, but in a lot of communities they haven't done a lot to engender that trust. And so to, you know, tell a woman to go report her batterer or her rapist when we know there's still only about a 10% chance well, for the rapist, about a 10% chance they'll actually be arrested and convicted, why would I expose her to that? So that's my response.
I would, you know, basically say the same thing. I think before this job, I did this work as an attorney, and I think it maybe should be a requirement that attorneys doing this kind of work maybe go to social work school, because you have the amount of sensitivity and the amount of meeting your client, talk about jargon, but it's true, meeting your client where they are in this kind of work for physical safety reasons alone, it's beyond significant. And I guess I would just to make sure that we do know how far we have not come. I heard about a story recently, I don't know if people know the difference between a desk appearance ticket and when you actually get arrested and arraigned and then you come back to court later. But basically it's like you could commit a crime other than getting a parking ticket and you get a ticket, okay? There's a point to this story, it's not about parking. So often, believe it or not, sometimes still police officers, even though they're not allowed to, write up domestic violence crimes as desk appearance tickets, which is pretty awful in and of itself. But another thing that happens with domestic violence victims, even in New York City, and I was one who's saying how great New York City is, so like I said, I like to see both sides of it. They write up desk appearance tickets for victims who they say have falsely reported crimes against them. And this is one of the things that gets my blood boiling, beyond boiling, I don't know what that would be. So a neighbor calls and says, sounds like something horrible is happening at my neighbor's house. The police come, victim's there, perpetrator's not because he beat her up and she's visible injuries, so he's left, so he can't be arrested. But the case is written up and assigned to a detective, and the guy should be arrested, and that's that. And in New York City, we have domestic violence officers who do home visits, and they do great work, but in some instances they don't. And so I've heard of this happening where a police officer will go for a home visit, and at that point, the victim recants her story, and then they give her a desk appearance ticket. And in some instances, I imagine maybe they still have wounds from the beating, and I guess that's a point of a really, really obvious example of why you would never want to pressure anybody to use the systems, and the systems are good systems, and you know, not good systems, but you know, we're trying, most of the time we're trying to do good by them, but they don't get implemented correctly. So I mean, that's just a people know all of their options as opposed to telling them there's only one option. And you could maybe speak to, though, I do think that there's complications for some immigrants who might be, feeling pressured for other reasons that we didn't get into tonight when it comes to U visas, which is the way that folks can get status because they're crime victims, and that gets tricky. As an immigration attorney, which I wasn't, I think you obviously are still going to meet your client where they are, but it's a different situation.
I just want to add one or two things to that. I think it's really important to really figure out, what are we offering as well? Are we offering orders of protections? Are we looking for family court? That's, and we have to be careful about that. I think the first question would be, and I think not to reiterate everything that's been mentioned, it's like, what do you need? Find out what they need, right? This is not a one-size-fits-all. Order of protections may not be the best thing for that particular individual. That might exacerbate the violence. So it's just really just figuring out what they need. So it's pushed to, get someone into a courtroom or police station. Just really kind of figure out what they need, what's happening, at the very least safety plan with them. There's various types of safety plan that you can do.
After saying that we've come a really long way and getting everyone excited, I just want to mention that there are countries in the world, Sudan is one of them, where if a woman does report that she was raped and it was outside of her marriage, then she will also be charged with adultery. In a lot of cases, it's not even an option for women because it means that they will also be punished. But I really think that there are things that you can do. and that's the truth, just because we're surrounded by people who are in our lives, and there are often many things that we can do, whether it's being supported, whether it's listening, or offering resources of all kinds. Whether systems are dependable or not, we can become dependable to each other, accountable to each other, and that's really important. And at the same time, when I first started this work, it was just such a personal issue, and I really was very excited about doing something and changing the world with it. And it took me some time to really recognize that there's an intensity that we come with when we're trying to help somebody else, because we just want to help them, and we want to see them getting better and some situation resolved, and we have to be mindful of our the desire that we have to fix something and to resolve the situation, and recognize that that's our need. That's not the other person's need. And it's really important to, like you said, get a sense of what this other person wants, how comfortable they are talking about it, whether they want you to be talking about it to somebody else. All of these things are really important. So reporting often is the last thing people do and want to do, but before reporting, there are many, many things that you can do, and there are countless agencies, culturally specific, linguistically specific, so as in agencies that have people there who speak languages that people speak if they're not comfortable speaking in English. So that's a really great place to start. Just referring people.
And I just want to read one thing that didn't get said is that for battered women, when they leave, is one of the most dangerous times for them. So to encourage a woman to leave, knowing that risk, I'm not willing to take that on. I also think that until we can eliminate racism in our criminal justice system, I think we're going to continue to find people of color, communities of color, reluctant to turn their men over to a hostile criminal justice system. And so I think that I just read a great book called The Revolution Begins at Home. I wouldn't be surprised some of y'all aren't in it as authors. And it really talks about, kind of going back to looking at some indigenous ways of holding, as you do, people accountable for their behavior in a way that's outside the criminal justice system. Not that I know a lot of y'all must be criminal justice folks. I do think that you can make a difference. We're John Day, yeah, that's right. So you can make a difference. I've worked with some incredible sex crimes officers that got it and have gotten it for almost 30 years. And so that is what can make a difference. When people know that this system is going to be responsive, the word gets out, and I think law enforcement, prosecutors, judges can make a big difference if they're willing to, be supportive and begin where people start.
Another question?
I kind of had a question about how, well, I guess like coming from when you were saying the men's perspective, like how to educate people, like maybe not just men, but just people in power, how to deal with these women and like, for example, like I've been doing research on like rape in the military system and how the people that are in charge of like dealing with the women are like the men that work in their units or the men of power that are doing the crimes themselves. So like, I don't know if you guys know like how are they approaching educating men and women of power to like change these systems, or like within prisons, like women that are abused. Like I just don't know like what we're doing for that. So.
Perfect question for you.
I think, it takes time. That's really the answer, because it's taken so many years to really, develop these systems that really, oppress people, around race, class, gender, sexual orientation, all of these things. And these things are kind of built in. You talk about the military. There's organizations that are, trying to do that work around military sexual violence, like SWAN, Service Women Action Network, and so people are, there's people at multiple things need to happen at multiple levels. On a systemic change level, on an intimate level. So there's many things that need to be done. It's never like a really quick fix, but really, if you really look at how can we change. Again, I always go back to change the attitudes and belief systems and the things that support it, right? Because I'm a man, I have male body parts, I have male privilege, right? So, and for me, working with men of color, one thing that's really effective for them, looking at their position of power in sexism versus their position of power in racism, right? So for them, they see, and I do a lot of been doing this work for years, like, what are you talking about? I got male privilege. What are you talking about? I don't have a job, I don't have all these things, right? You may not have white male privilege, but you do have male privilege in your community. So it's really about really showing them how they show up, where you have entitlement, where you have privilege, and then using those examples to see how that plays out in other people's lives. And I think the other part of it too is, when my work with men and boys in particular, and men and boys typically run these institutions that we're trying to change as well. So it's really, really figuring out how they show up and the impact that they have, not only just on people who are they're not in a position that aren't in a position of power, but like how does power play out? What detriment does power have to them? So it's really, again, being creative around how we do that. But it takes time. There's different organizations that need to be in place, from the legal to the social. So there's multiple levels that need to happen. But really, like was mentioned here, people who may not be, bystanders are important. Really redefining, how we define, accountability for not just saying that I did it, but to responsibility and being in this thing around changing. Social change is important. So really looking at it on multiple levels, and so it really depends on knowing the area and the target you're really trying to focus on what's been effective in the past. What things have been happening now, and how can we kind of move that a bit forward. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's time.
I would just add how important, in general, preventative work is, which Connect does, and a lot of agencies do, and the mayor's office even has an office doing that now. Because bystanders who, let their friend tape their friend sexually assaulting another college student or high school student, they're only themselves however old, but what if they had been exposed in middle school to any sort of curriculum that talked about what these things, and it's still, even though there's so many agencies, and it's like, it's what we all do all the time, it's still very taboo to talk about this stuff, especially with younger children. And, you know, I mean, there's like not sex ed in a lot of schools. So I think the preventative piece is really important but exciting, because now there is a lot more of it. There wasn't when I was in middle school, you know, so if we can do that, that's what I would add to your question.
So last year at Seki, we started a little program where we just connect with police precincts and go in, you know, in the morning at the police precincts, there are roll calls that happen. So we figured out that, you know, we basically advocated our way into the roll calls and gave ourselves a little bit of time. So, you know, some of us would show up during roll call time and talk about domestic violence and the importance of like why police officials need to be sensitive to it, why this is important. And it's honestly, it doesn't change the world, it doesn't even change the attitudes necessarily all the time, but showing up, like an agency connecting with law enforcement to sensitize and train is a great way to find some kind of resolve around what you're asking, you know. So if you as a student, if you're doing research and you're interested in trying to make a difference on that level institutionally, then what you can do is hold the institutions accountable, connect them to these agencies, and you know, a lot of agencies are ready and willing to do lots of sensitivity training, and we all talk about systems and why systems are not effective and why we don't go to systems. And we have tools where, you know, with which we can educate systems and change systems. And you as students like have that tool. You have extreme abilities through the center here too, you know. So there are many ways where you can sort of show up and place yourself in the middle of and sort of become bridges between the agencies and institutions, and then as a result, really help a lot of people.
So I'll add my 2 cents worth. A long time ago, a woman named Peggy Sandé did a research on what makes a culture rape prone, and she said it's cultures that don't value women's roles and that have a culture of violence. So obviously the opposite, having a culture of nonviolence and respecting women's roles, even if they're different, really can help set the tone. I think that there is no doubt in my mind that all of the isms are so closely related. We have got to really appreciate everybody for who they are and really celebrate that difference and diversity amongst people. And I think until we're really genuine in that as a country, as long as we have other people or people we can point to and go, well, everyone but them, then I think we're going to continue to have challenges along these lines. At the same time, it's amazing to me the attitudes that have been changed in law enforcement and criminal justice over, you know, in my time of 28 years. I was told when I was working in South Texas that I would never change the machismo down in South Texas. I would never change the law enforcement's attitudes, and there's no doubt that we did. I mean, these were the days when we didn't have the sexual assault nurse examiners, and we had to go in and talk to hospital people about don't make the victim wait for 12 hours because there's someone with a broken arm. There has been so much improvement in attitudes, and the Department of Justice has got incredible trainings now for law enforcement and for prosecutors that are really effective. I think that, you know, most law enforcement officers that I know and prosecutors and judges want to do the right thing. They just may not be, you know, aware. They may be so stuck in, you know, coming from the South, a good old boys network, that they themselves get caught in this kind of bystander mentality. And with bystanders, there's 3 things we have to teach them. One is we have to teach them to notice what's going on around them. A lot of us, especially in the city, we don't focus, we don't pay attention to what's going on around us, and we need to teach people to notice. We need to teach them to interpret what they see as abuse, when it is abusive, when it's, you know, that rape joke, or, you know, somebody's pushing somebody else, or the bullying in the classroom. And then the third thing we have to teach them is to be responsible. We have to be our sisters and brothers keepers. We have to let go of some of that Western individualism because we are responsible. And the anti-bullying stuff works for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and then regular, you know, high school and workplace bullying and mobbing. And so it's so connected. We just had a situation where students used one of our faculty's vision impairment to sneak out of class, and not recognizing their privilege, as sighted people, to take advantage of this situation. And it was abusive. I mean, it wasn't physically abusive, but to me it was abusive. And we had to be assimilated, talked like social workers do. We process, and we're still processing. But we really call them on being bystanders and not holding their peers accountable for that behavior. And I think we have to hold each other accountable. You want to say anything?
I don't know, I guess those.
Just pass that.
The only thing I'll add, going back to your original question, is the best people I found to teach the men and boys are men and boys themselves, or police officers, a police officer, judges, especially a judge. So it's really important to convert one and then, get them to move the ball forward.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
Hi, I actually have two questions. One is for Ms. Hannah Pennington, and the other one is for anyone on the panel that would like to answer. My first question for Ms. Pennington is, the centers that you work for, do they have programs that help people in LGBTQ relationships deal with domestic violence, like men on men? Those are especially important. And my question for the panel is, are there programs being implemented that reach out to high school students that are affected by domestic violence? Because I went to high school where more than one person was in a domestic violence situation, even though their parents hadn't been.
Really good question. And actually, usually when we do these kinds of talks, we say at the beginning that I'm going to use she, even though I don't always mean she, because obviously, that's why we're here. Predominantly, victims are women, but certainly a lot are men as well. And most every organization, there's a few still, that I work with, and certainly the Family Justice Centers run by the Mayor's Office do serve LGBTQ populations, and we have AVP, the Anti-Violence Project, at 2 of the centers, and hope to have them in Manhattan as well. And actually, those, I'm thinking about Sharon Staple, who is the executive director of AVP, who was actually in that picture at the signing. She actually was next to the president, which is really exciting. So to answer your question, and I should have mentioned, so my bad for not saying it, we certainly, I think I mentioned just very quickly in passing, we also help victims of elder abuse. So not just intimate partner elder abuse. And we also see children as well. So if that answers your question. And then your second question, I mean, the New York City Healthy Teen Academy actually does provide workshops for folks in high schools, but also just places where young adults are. So if you looked at the OCDV website, under their tab, there's lots of information about their program, but other programs as well, and others can speak about them. But there's a lot of services right now, not so much enough funding for it, but there are a lot of services at different agencies. So there's, especially if you want to be a liaison to your communities on it, so it would be a fantastic thing.
There are so many resources that we can all share with you. The Anti-Violence Project is one of them. Another one is New York Sexual Assault Coalition. I think that's the way the name is. And there are a lot of community groups too. There's a really great organization called the Audre Lorde Project. They do really great work. And then really in different immigrant communities, there are different small groups. Like the South Asian community has a couple of groups. One of the most well-known one is SALGA. It's a South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association. And a lot of these organizations basically are, safe, supportive spaces for folks who are going through all the same kind of violence and abuse that everyone else goes through, The truth is, I have to acknowledge that even now, no matter what we are absolutely exclusive, and we do not talk about LGBTQ issues as part of, violence in LGBTQ communities as part of violence against women, and that's just a shortcoming that's still present. I think every one of us is also very mindful, and we try to do be inclusive in the way we talk and do our work. In Saki recently, we actually joined with the Anti-Violence Project to sensitize our staff so that we can, we pick up the phone and we assume that women are calling about men, and even the way we ask questions can be very limiting and be very exclusive. So it's definitely, something that organizations have to be accountable for the way we do our work. Fortunately, we do have many resources, so if you want any, all of us can probably give you 5 or 10 each. And in terms of youth programs, there are also many youth programs that exist. Saki, right now, last year we started we haven't really named it yet because we can't figure out whether we should stick with high school or college age, and really, we haven't fully formed the program yet, but there's a youth program we started working with SAYA, South Asian Youth Action, which is a youth group in the South Asian community, and we work to talk about teen dating violence, relationship abuse, and all different kinds of abuse, like even if domestic violence happening within your household, even if you're not if your parents are going through it, or if you're a victim of sexual assault or child abuse, there are lots and lots of organizations. I can again, if you want to contact me or come talk to me later, I can give you a list of organizations that you can connect with.
One of the great things that, well, it's not, I guess it is a great thing about the current VAWA is that there's now going to be funds specifically available to do outreach and services to the LGBT community. That was part of this VAWA. And VAWA has that history. I actually worked as the scientific lead for 5 years on the Department of Justice's Measuring the Effectiveness of the Violence Against Women Act from 2001 to 2006. And VAWA, the way it's been funded is that there's a lot of little grants that you can get. For example, there is a specific one for addressing domestic violence and sexual assault on college campuses. They do not exist for high school students, at least not funded through VAWA. But from the time I began this work in '85, we started, at first grade talking about good touch, bad touch, and by the high school we were definitely talking about, respect and boundaries and dating violence and things like that. In the early '90s, I did a survey looking at the LGBT community in Austin to find out if they knew that the rape crisis was even available to them. And whereas most of the women, most of the lesbians did, the guys didn't. And one of the problems to this day is that many domestic violence shelters don't provide services for men, gay or straight. And that has been something that has been slowly changing, but I read something this morning that over half of the shelters don't take male survivors, again, gay or straight. So we've got a lot of work to do in the LGBT community as far as us reaching in, and I really do think that some of the best services I've seen around the country have been LGBT organizations who've taken on the issue of domestic violence and sexual assault. Even though lesbians were part of the founding of the whole violence against women movement 40 so years ago, they've kind of been pushed out as we've become more mainstream. And now we have people with degrees and licenses and everything running our programs much more than many times kind of the grassroots mothers of this movement.
And my organization Connect, we can talk a little bit more afterwards if you want some resources about doing workshops and programs in high schools, because we're currently doing that now in middle schools and grammar schools. People call them grammar schools anymore, but middle schools, high schools, and college campuses as well. And we have these really intensive programs, really looking, some are single gender groups, some are mixed groups, and we really talk about, how it shows up, healthy relationships, but, domestic violence, teen dating violence, and the impact and so forth. And doing it in a really creative way. We're in the Bronx at Quintin Walcott High School, and we're looking at having these discussions with young men around violence against women and making connections between domestic violence. And I just want to say, and you're correct in that, And just in terms of terminology as well, domestic violence is like the most commonly used term, but we really use intimate partner violence or gender violence that encompasses LGBTQ relationships and same-sex relationships, what have you. The school program is really looking at video game design. It has discussions around violence against women and gun and gang violence, connecting that, because 80% of young people involved in gun and gang violence are either witnessing domestic violence at home or child abuse at home. And so what they're not getting at home, they're getting through poor decisions in the community, in the streets, what have you.
I should have mentioned too that there is a resource directory. And RAP, see, we have so many things we could tell you, but there is a resource directory on if you go, and I should know, but my job's kind of new, so I don't remember the website exactly, but if you just go to the city, nyc.gov, and type in domestic violence, you'll get to our website, and there's a resource directory that you can actually filter all the many, many, many organizations in New York City that do this work by tons of fields. One of them, for the populations they serve, geographically, anything, it's a good resource, especially for anybody who wants to learn about what's available, and I should have mentioned that.
All right. One last question. Little one?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Janola Sogom, and I'm a student of John Jay College since last year. Unfortunately, I have been part of domestic violence, and what attracted my attention was the order protections that the gentleman mentioned before. I am a person that has an order protection because of this domestic violence, and I think that people, when they walk in institutions like a criminal court, where they can find the protection and the order protections, is because they need help first. And this is the reason that I personally walked in an institution like that, and I have that order protection that because of that, I'm very grateful and thankful to the person who protected me and who gave me that order protection. And I think he not only protected me, but he saved the other people that are part of the community that might have the same consequences from the other people like I had. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I wasn't criticizing the use of orders protections. I was saying it's not a one-size-fits-all. For some, it may make it worse. And in particular, it was mentioned earlier around people of color and undocumented people and their experiences around systems and police and what have you. And I get that all the time. I don't want to bring police into my life because histories of police brutality or just poor relationships with the police or criminal justice system. So I'm just recognizing that for some, it may be that's the only resource and that's safety for them and it works for them. But some people have other experiences around systems, and then also if and I talk to battlers all the time, telling them that your partner cannot violate order of protection, only you can. And some don't really understand that, don't take order of protection seriously, and it may make some survivors of violence, more in danger. That's the only point I was trying to make. So you're correct.
I think it's really great that it's working so well for you. So wonderful to hear that the systems also work, and that's true a lot of times also. I think we are all always just focused on fixing the system and fixing the problem, so we're always looking at what doesn't work in it. And I think that's incredibly important because then we make the systems more efficient. But thank you for sharing your story and for also showing that all of the work we do with the systems is actually effective.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank our panel, a wonderfully active panel. People who are committed to social change, people who work on the ground, people who deliver services, but also work the system and try and make things better for everybody. A really talented and informative panel. Thanks very much for being with us tonight. Thank you to our audience for some very good questions. And we have some refreshments in the back, Apodita, so please don't leave. stay and talk to the panelists, talk to each other, and happy International Women's Day.